Good evening. I'm Bishop Dwayne Royster, Executive Director of Power Interfaith, and I want to welcome you to this special conversation tonight that we're having around the issues of race and the church and the work that we have to do as an organization to be able to move our state, our cities, and our local communities forward. I'm very excited to be able to welcome to Power some very special guests, a new guest, new friend, and an old friend to come and be in conversation with us on tonight. As we remember the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, we are reminded that it wasn't Dr. King alone that brought about civil rights wins and brought about transformation in our society. It was folks sitting in the pews, folks that were riding the buses, folks that lived in the projects that decided to put their hands to the plow and push towards transformation, change, healing, and hope in a world that often felt very cruel and mean to them. Over the course of the last few months here at Power, we've been fighting for democracy in our country, fighting for the right of every human being's voice to be able to be heard in the halls of power, that people have the ability to be able to create change. And as a result of our desire to fight for democracy, we had to wage war against one of the provisions of that was fighting hard against democracy, which was rooted in our faith traditions, and that was white Christian nationalism. And as we talked about white Christian nationalism, as we went on a 3-week bus tour across the state of Pennsylvania, hitting just about every corner of our state, communities both big and small, where we had these conversations, the one thing that we began to realize was that there were stories behind white Christian nationalism and white supremacy and how they manifest themselves, whether it's to the African American community or the Jewish community, whether it's to our Asian Pacific Islander brothers and sisters or our Latinx folk, or whether we're talking about our indigenous siblings. There's an experience of white supremacy that even manifests itself in hard ways on white folk. And so tonight's MLK conversation begins to kind of take a look at some of the ways that white supremacy manifested itself in this country, the ways that it brought about harm to a community, the way it continues to manifest itself in the future, but also the ways that we can fight to counteract the effects of white supremacy, white Christian nationalism, and the evil that is oppression in this country. So I'm very excited tonight that we have a couple of special guests with us, as I mentioned earlier. And the first person I want to lift up is that of the Lisa Sharon Harper. Lisa Sharon Harper is actually, her family is native of Philadelphia. And I have to tell a little story. As Lisa and I were talking and preparing for this, we discovered that our mothers went to elementary school together at child school. And when I say elementary school together, I don't mean they were in the same building. I mean that literally they were in the same classroom together from their earliest days. We did not know that. We've known each other for years in our collective work towards justice here in the United States and beyond. And so I was very excited when Lisa's new book came out. And her book is actually a very powerful book that tells the story about her family. It's called Fortune: How Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All. And Lisa Sharon Harper is a work for Sojourners. She has written numerous books, including The Very Good Gospel. She's worked on Still Evangelical, shared with a bunch of other leaders, Forgive Us, Confessions of a Compromised Faith, Left, Right, and Christ, Evangelical Faith in Politics. Evangelical does not equal a Republican or Democrat, and so many other pieces of work that she has done throughout the years. We're so grateful. Lisa is now living back here in the city of Philadelphia after being in so many places from around the world. Lisa and I actually, when I went to Ferguson some years ago, she came down to Ferguson and we spent the night out on the streets together in Ferguson, marching and talking. And it was powerful to watch her challenge power and talk to the police and call them out for what they were doing in that particular moment in time. She's been on all sorts of media not only a columnist at Sojourners and an Allberg Theological Seminary Fellow, but she's been on TV One, Fox News Online, NPR, Al Jazeera America. You could read her writings in the CNN Belief Log, National Civic Review, the Huffington Post, Relevant Magazine, Essence Magazine. She has a master's degree in human rights from Columbia University in New York, and actually spent some time there leading a faith-based organizing movement in the city of New York as well. And so we're so glad that she didn't consider it robbery to come here and spend a little time with us on today. And then our next guest is actually a friend of Powers, and Dr. Stephen G. Ray, who used to be the director of the Urban Theological Institute at Lutheran Theological Seminary, is now retired as the 13th president of Chicago Theological Seminary. He's the president emeritus of Chicago Theological Seminary. He's the immediate past president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. He is a colleague and an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And Dr. Ray's authored several works as well, including A Struggle from the Start, The Black Community of Hartford, 1639 to 1960, and Do No Harm, Social Sin and Christian Responsibility. He's also been a co-author of Black Church Studies and Introduction, and an African-American systematic theology, co-editor of Awake to the Moment, Introduction to Theology, and a contributor to several other books. Many of us remember Dr. Ray when he was here at Lutheran Theological Seminary and lived right in Mount Airy, but he's also been in other places. He's been a professor at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. He was also at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary as a professor of theology and philosophy as well. He's got both his MDiv and his PhD from Yale University. And we should also say that Dr. Ray is a board member for Faith in Action, one of our parent bodies. And so we're grateful that he took time out of his schedule, including away from the Seminary of Southwest, where he's serving as a visiting professor right now, to come and be a part of this dialogue. And then finally, I just want to thank my friend, the Reverend Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler, who is our political director here at Power, who jumped in for me at the last minute. I had a family emergency, who jumped in at the last minute to facilitate this conversation between Lisa Sharon Harper and Dr. Stephen G. Ray. You'll be amazed as we sit back and study and learn through Lisa Sharon Harper's story of her family's journey from across the sea to this country, to Philadelphia, her thoughts on that experience, about where we are right now, and her and Dr. Ray thinking about where we have to go together. I'm grateful for the three of them. I hope you enjoy this experience, but I hope that you don't just enjoy it, that you take it and do something with it. This conversation tonight will be made available on YouTube. You are able to go back and to share it with your congregation, use it as a discussion piece, and let's learn together, grow together. As we study today parts of the African-American history and the African-American diaspora, and we understand the journey of a segment of people, especially those in the northeast part of this country and from the northern South, the upper part of the South, about how we have to combat our past to be able to get to our future. God bless your family. And finally, I just want to thank Selena Singleton and Caleb Washington for their hard work on helping to put this together for us as well. We deeply appreciate you. So, beloved, I'm going to turn it in the hands of Reverend Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler and our special guests that are with us today.
Well, listen, we are here today to have a great conversation with two persons who we believe will have a lot to say to our community, those of us who are at Power Interfaith and the multiple congregations and communities that we represent in southeastern Pennsylvania. Listen, today I'm sitting in for my good friend and brother, Bishop Dwayne David Royster. And today, he's not asked me to go on assignment for him out in the cold or anywhere else like that. This is actually a fun one. Typically, when someone calls you at the last minute and says, I need a favor, it's something that you're going to regret. But today, I'm actually excited about it. So today, I have the opportunity of interviewing someone who has written a book that is going to be very important to generations of African Americans in particular, but I believe really to the rest of the American community. We're sitting today with Lisa Sharon Harper. She is the author of Fortune: How Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All. Whew. I mean, we could spend like an entire hour on the title, but welcome back home to Philadelphia.
Thank you so much, Reverend Tyler. I mean, it has been absolutely a joy to meet you, and I'm looking forward to being in conversation.
Well, thank you. And so Bishop has not sent me alone. I also have the opportunity to be in conversation as a conversation partner, co-interrogator, whatever you want to call it, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Ray, who is no stranger to our faith community and has been a thought partner with us for a very, very long time. Currently, he is on loan to Austin, Texas. Lord have mercy. He is the Crump Visiting Professor, Seminary of the Southwest. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. An honor to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, so Lisa, let's talk first, if it's okay, about your journey. This does not sound like it's the kind of book that begins with an academic question. It sounds more personal.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about the journey itself that led to Fortune?
That's a really great question. I mean, 30 years ago, I called my mom because I got to this point in my development where I just wanted to know, who are we? Like, where did we come from as people of African descent? You know, I watched Roots every single time that it came on TV, from the time that it premiered until I was, you know, out of high school and into college. And so Aunt Kizzy was my Aunt Kizzy, right? Like, Chicken George was my uncle. Like, but I knew that that wasn't enough. And I just got curious. So I asked my mom, and I remember that very first family tree that we ever did. It was 1991, actually. And I didn't have any names. I actually only had the dates of when grandfather lived, great-grandfather might have lived, and so forth. But now, flash forward 30 years from then, and I've got like 1,000 people on the family tree, and we were able to trace our family tree to Maudlin McGee and Sambo Game, who were brought here on indentured ship and in a slave ship in 1682 and 1686, and they had Fortune. And because they were a mixed race couple, an affair, because the woman was already married, they fell squarely within the very first race laws that were ever created on this soil. The first race laws were in Virginia in 1662, and then Maryland followed with their first race laws in 1664. So Virginia's race laws were created to solve a particular problem. Laws are always created for a particular problem on the ground, right? A perceived problem. Theirs was the mixed race children who were confusing the racial caste system, and they were coming from white men and raping enslaved black women. And they began to fight for their freedom using the British laws, saying, I am a citizen, and according to British law, you cannot enslave another citizen. So Elizabeth Key took her case to court in 1656. And she won. And so, whoa, you know, okay, she won her thing. And then there's this flood of other people who start bringing their cases to court. So it only took a few years before their legislature, who were the planting class, said, wait, you know, they could have said, okay, we're going to transition to a full, like, capitalist economy. We're going to pay our people. We're going to do right by people. But they didn't. Instead, they said, how can we maintain our supremacy on this land? So they passed the very first race law in Virginia, changing where citizenship comes from. It would no longer come through the line of the father. Now it would come through the line of the mother, and they added the two words, in perpetuity. So then 2 years later, 1664, Maryland perceives it has a problem. Again, mixed race kids running around confusing the caste system. But this is the exact opposite problem, actually. They do have white men raping enslaved black women, but they don't perceive that to be a problem. It's the problem of white women, indentured servants, marrying and having children with enslaved black men. There were over 600 mixed-race children that trace back to white women in the colonial era alone, just in Maryland and Delaware. 600. So this was a real problem, according to the planting class. So they decided to get together in 1664, and they said, okay, we're going to stop this, and this is how we're going to do it. If any white woman marries an enslaved black man and has his children, she shall be enslaved to that husband's master, and her children will be enslaved in perpetuity. So when Maudlin and Sambo found each other, had an affair, and had Fortune in 1687, they fell squarely in the line of fire of the first race laws in Maryland. And Fortune's fate was then determined by the laws, the race laws, as they developed throughout her life. And she ended up being indentured for 31 years, because by the time that the law shook out, at that time, it said, if your mother is white, you can't be enslaved. But if your father is black in this equation, you will be indentured. And if they're married, you will be indentured for 21 years. And if they are not married, you will be indentured for 31 years. So Fortune was indentured for 31.
Wow. Can you, what was the genealogist in me who stuck at 1818 in my family?
Right. Which is a way. It's a long way.
It is, but it's, and I kind of think I know who his father was, but now I'm not certain. It's all speculation at that point. How did you break past this?
Yeah.
I mean, what was the...
How, right?
I mean, trust me, there are a lot of people who are going to watch this who are going to want to know, like, because 1600s is almost unheard of.
It is. It is. Ancestry.com DNA, they now have a way that they can trace your DNA community. Like, where are the people in the world that have the greatest cluster of your DNA? And they've traced my DNA to two communities, one on my mom's side, one on my father's side. The one on my mom's side traces back to the earliest Africans who were here on this soil. So the early Virginia Africans. I don't know if it goes back as far as 1619, but they basically trace it at least to 1700. Maudlin McGee came in 1682, Sambo 1686, and I even know the ship he came on, because the transatlantic, there's a transatlantic voyage database traced every single slave ship, and I went back. And I found that there was only one slave ship that came into the Maryland ports during the time that he was alive, before Fortune was born. That because the DNA actually traces back that far, if you've been here that amount of time, there's going to be a lot of connections. The very first time that I ever got on Ancestry, I was tracing not the Fortune line, but the Lawrence line, and I found myself back in Jamestown. So that's another line of my mom's family. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm like hanging around with people who I'm reading about in history books. They're like right here. Well, that's because there weren't that many people here at that time. So if you were there, you knew somebody, right? So when the moment when we realized that there was this connection with Fortune it was a Christmas Eve, and I was sitting there just, fingering through the Ancestry.com. It's kind of how me and my mom bond as we do this. And I was trying to get over the wall of slavery, to find any evidence of the existence of Philip Fortune, my second times great grandfather on my mother's line. And Philip Fortune, I'm looking, and I'm looking on the slave schedules for a master named Fortune in Virginia, and I can't find one. But then in the census, I find his name, and I'm like, how am I finding my ancestor's name in the census? That means he was free, and he was a little boy. So I'm like, what's going on here? And my mom says, well, my grandfather used to say that, grandma was kind of uppity because, they were always free. That was the story but she didn't believe it. And so now we have actually evidence, because they were definitely free before the Civil War. Now we trace she starts looking for fortunes, and she's the one who made the first discovery of Fortune, Game, McGee, Sambo, and Maudlin. And that was because of an amazing research project by a man named Paul Heinig, who is the foremost genealogist that has traced all of the free black Americans, free black people, African Americans, in 5 major colonies: Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. So if your family traces back to a free black person, there's a registry. He's actually done all the work, and that's what happened.
Well, I'm going to take a look at it because that's a part of our line as well. Yeah. So, so Dr. Ray, now listening to all of this, what's your initial reaction? I want to. How are you feeling with this? I'm thinking of you in particular, talking about the ways in which people commodified black pain and all of that. How are you feeling right now?
Well, I think, one of the most important pieces in this story, and I so appreciate the way you've unfolded it, is that it reminds us how race as such, and we as creatures of race, right? I mean, race constructed us was highly unstable.
Yes.
Right? That it didn't and doesn't always mean the same thing.
That's right.
And so part of what the challenge becomes is in understanding that it's unstable, to try to see how it's morphed through time, right? To see what it meant to be free. Because even though you were free, it was still the case that the condition of black people was created by the institution of slavery. So whether you were slave or free, your condition was still connected to that. But I mean, it's powerful to be able to hear the story, because another piece, and I particularly appreciate the notice that it's so confused because there are consenting relationships.
Yeah.
So that means that it reminds us these were human beings.
Yeah.
Right? We often think about historical figures and we think about them as pictures, black and white photographs, but these were living, breathing human beings.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the power of talking about how race as it is being constructed is actually breaking human beings.
Yes, and I also would add that part of the thing that kind of jumped off the page for me when I did my research was that when you consider the legislators as human beings, when you ask the question, why are they perceiving a problem? Why is this a problem? It's a problem because they're losing money. They're losing money. They have people who are being born into their plantations who they think should be free labor now, or they want to use to pad their bank accounts. But the question becomes, are they citizens? So the thing that blew my mind was that race as a construct became a thing around three things: the question of racial hierarchy, gender hierarchy, and citizenship. So race, you cannot extricate any of those three things when you're dealing with race: gender, race, or citizenship.
Well, particularly in that period when we talk about the idea of race, it's important to remember that it is not even a term yet, right? It's not an idea yet, because there's what becomes race as we live it today was not just taking form, but because the only thing that was clear was people who were of African descent, which is an important thing as we talk about how we use the term today, is that when the term was used then, because recall in the 17th century, the 1600s, and the early 1800s, they didn't refer to them as anything but Africans. So whether they had just gotten off the ship or whether or not they were the children of people who had they were still referred to as Africans. And an interesting coincidence, that database of ships that you were talking about, I did a review on that when it first came out, and I think it was back in 2002 or 2003. Very, very powerful tool. But that point, and the only reason I keep coming back to this instability is because a part of what the system of racial oppression wants to do over and over again is to fix the meaning so that it can only mean one thing.
Yeah.
That's why it gets so uncomfortable when we start changing how we refer to each other and to ourselves, right? So when I was having a conversation a bit earlier with some of the young people here, that's why it became problematic when we stopped being Negroes and became black.
Hello.
And when it became problematic when we became African Afro-American and African-American, because the system needs for us to be one thing.
That's true. And the system is constructed to create, protect, and entrench the supremacy
Yes.
of people of European descent. And in particular, even among them, really just the English. I mean, they fought like, I don't know what, just to make the English the only white people.
Oh, certainly. Mm-hmm.
Right? So Benjamin Franklin writes to the crown and says, we can't let those Germans be white
Yes.
because they're going to muddy the race. Isn't that something? And so throughout the whole 19th century, you have white people coming into, or Europeans coming into America fighting all the way up through the Supreme Court in order to be named as white. Why? Because it was clear in that original conception from 1662 all the way through the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, what it meant to be white was to be a citizen. And what it means to be citizen is to exercise dominion on the land. And this is where we get to our faith. Because we know the first page of the Bible says that if you are a human being, you are created in the image of God. And what it means to be created in the image of God is to be created with the call, the divine call, and the capacity, all things being equal, to exercise dominion on the land, to exercise stewardship of the land. So I think one of the things that is so striking to me is that what people did in the name of faith, in the name of Christian faith, was to wage war against the image of God on earth through slavery and oppression. And our ancestors bore the brunt of that.
And continue to.
And continue to.
I mean, you know, so I have this question, which is, when do black people get to be white in America? Because everybody's had a chance, right? You know, it's every group comes in, and we discovered that that it's an ever expanding. You know, as you said, you know, there's a time where, you know, just think Western Europeans not being considered white.
That's right.
Forget the Eastern Europeans,
That's
you
right.
know, Slavic people and Jewish people, but like everybody's gotten their chance. And, you know, but for some reason it is so entrenched, which I guess kind of brings me back to the title of your book, you know, How Race Broke My Family. Can you just talk about that part? I want to talk about how to repair it, but in what ways, as you kind of think about it, and Dr. Ray, feel free to jump in as well, when you kind of think about this wonderful family that you found, you know, these great experiences, and looking, if race had not taken the turn that it did,
That's right.
where would this family be today?
Isn't that the question? So when I look back at Fortune in 1705, she was sentenced to 31 years of indentured servitude. Now, she had several children while she was indentured, and her children had children while they were indentured. Never were any men ever mentioned in court. So I started to wonder, where are these children coming from? Are they in a brothel? Like, people literally, as I was talking to friends about this, even genealogists, they're like, maybe she's in a brothel. No. I did a little basic DNA matching search before they actually made it a little harder to see people way back. And I found the surnames of her indenturing families in me.
Wow.
So they were raping their indentured servants, their mixed race indentured children who were indentured for 31 years simply because their family was mixed race. They were raping them in order to get free labor for another 21 years, another 31 years, another 7 years. And so that was a system that developed, and it developed from the very beginning, from colonial times, in order to exploit our bodies, to pad white people's bank accounts. Now, what would have happened had black people, mixed race people, been able to work for pay and be citizens and exercise dominion, exercise agency, what we were called to do as human beings? Well, perhaps Fortune and her children might not have experienced the trauma of rape, this trauma of separation from their children, because even though they were indentured, and they did eventually become free, they lost their children forever, because Sarah Fortune, her daughter, she had children that were then basically given to the master because the masters owned them for the time that they had them. They moved to Virginia. And there's never any mention again of them coming and being with Sarah ever again. So you know the trauma of child separation. I mean, that's an indentured family. Can you imagine? Now take that and imagine the majority of us in America, people of African descent, and on 3 other lines of my family I experienced this. The systematic production of black bodies in order to pad the bank accounts of European bodies, and the separation of those families through selling them into the Deep South after the transatlantic slave trade closes. You have the intracontinental slave trade. See the emotional trauma that happens then. See the exploitation of our bodies that happens after the close of the Civil War and the rise of Jim Crow. My ancestors were in South Carolina at that time, a whole other line of the family. And I started to look and consider their plight. Leah Ballard was the last enslaved woman in our family. She is fabled in our family to have had 17 children. But on any census, you can only find 12 listed, and they start in 1880. That she's the first census she appears on, which means there's never any children that appear that were born in slavery. Most likely, 5 of her children were born in slavery and either died or were sold into the deeper South. Mm-hmm. What does that do to a woman? What does that do to those children? What does that do to the family system? So what couldn't have happened? We could have thrived because we had thriving family systems and units that would not have had 400 years of separation, first through slavery, then through Jim Crow and peonage, which might have been a part of my family story as well, and then through mass incarceration in the 20th century. So we have about 400 years of a pattern of exploitation of our bodies for the padding of white men's bank accounts.
Backed by the entire system in the country, so finance, government, and Dr. Ray couldn't have been possible without the church.
That is for real.
Right. I mean, the role that the church played. But, you know, before we touch on that, I think one of the and this is the ironies of history, is that in order for a history to unfold that would have allowed us to be able to participate as full human beings, the world that brought us here could not have existed. Right, and what I mean by that is that the transatlantic slave trade created an entire world, right?
Yeah, it's true.
Not just an ideology, but an entire world. Mm-hmm. So if we think back to and do a sort of thought experiment about what would it have been, it would have been a world that we would never hear in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think this is a piece of what the church had to do, was that the church had to create a moral discourse that allowed people to participate in the transatlantic slave trade.
That's right.
And still be Christians. Right? That was the moral question that gets transferred to these shores. Mm-hmm. Right? Is the participation in the transatlantic slave trade that creates the entire theological problem, moral problem of how it is that you can engage in such an abomination and still be considered a good Christian. You know, now here's the rub, right, is that most of the churches in America were not supported by the state. So what that meant was that they relied on the gifts and tithing of these good Christians, of these men.
Wow.
I mean, the church relied for its existence on them, right? Because it's not a state-supported thing that, gets a monthly stipend from the tax collector.
Right.
It was all voluntary. So the people who were voluntary were the ones who were creating the largest pot of wealth. And those were, of course, the people who were engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, the internal slave trade, and the plantation systems and other forms of slavery. So that's where the church becomes implicated, is that on these shores, without slavery, the church would never have survived.
Can I add to that too? Because one other thing that that adds maybe texture, and also you can see just how bad it was and how far back it goes, is in Maryland, when they passed that law that white women are now going to be enslaved if they marry an enslaved black man. They look up about a decade later and they realize that the planter class, which is basically them, but they realize that the planter class is now forcing their indentured white women to marry and have children with enslaved black men, because according to the law, that gets them free labor. This is a Catholic colony. Maryland is a Catholic colony. And so they decide, they clutch their pearls and they say, oh, we're sorry, we didn't mean to do that. And then they say, okay, in order to level the playing field here, we're going to take the keys to indenture or enslavement, the decision making, out of the hands of the planter. And we're going to put the keys into the hands of the church. So now the church becomes the main arbiter of who gets enslaved and who gets indentured. And the law gets changed. Also in that whole same mix, the law gets changed, and you'll see this in Virginia as well as Maryland, because at first you couldn't enslave another Christian. Well, then they finally said, well, actually, no, you can. So these theological questions are being answered for economic purposes.
And so even later then, as the new nation is formed, so the Methodists, I pastor the first AME church, so I'm at Mother Bethel. And Richard Allen was, it said in 1784, to have attended the founding of Methodism in America, officially the Christmas conference. These were large white Methodist churches. So there were several black folk there. Was he there or not? Who knows? But there were some black folk there. The point is, the first book of discipline to come out, because the founder, John Wesley from England, was an abolitionist who encouraged William Wilberforce to fight to end slavery. He wanted a free church. The first book of discipline in 1784 said that that no slave holder would be a good Methodist or a Methodist in good standing. So you couldn't be a Methodist, white, if you owned slaves.
Wow.
By 3 years later, in 1787, Richard Allen is walking out of St. George's because they've instituted segregated pews in Philly, in Baltimore, in Charleston, in New York, all over the place. To your point, Dr. Ray, because the church discovered those slaveholders said clearly, fine, you don't want my money? I will be Baptist, I'll be Presbyterian, I'll be Lutheran, I just won't be Methodist. They say, oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. And so the law changes right there in the discipline.
Wow.
Until it finally splits in 1844. They have what is a precursor to the Civil War, where finally the Methodist Church splits over slavery. The Baptist Church splits over. All these churches split.
Every denomination.
So
every single denomination split over slavery.
Well, as a Congregationalist.
Okay.
All right. We have our sins of the transatlantic slave trade, which is probably why we didn't split, because the money had already been made.
Right.
But the Congregationalist Church did not split over slavery.
One of the only white churches to make it, huh? One of the only white churches to make it without the split.
Well, and I think part of what it was that there were some, not many, but some strong free black communities in New England as well as in New York, which is about as far as we went at that point in time, who were very strongly abolitionists. Now, where our fissure was at was how strongly people advocated for abolitionism, right? Because recall with the Amistad event that those were Congregationalists who were fighting on their behalf. So I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture, because we did have our split. But I think, one of the things to notice as well in the conversation is that it is an economic issue, but we can't ever forget the power of ideology. People really do believe things. People really do, people really do believe faith claims. And that's why it's so important to fight over what those claims are in the public square. So it really mattered that you had the church saying you can be a good Christian and a slaveholder, right? That mattered.
That's right.
Because what that did was it created a space in which people weren't having this existential split in which they couldn't do any other. We saw the same thing in our lifetimes. in the civil rights movement, in which basically the church split at that point, and an irreparable split, what would become sort of the Christian right, and the evangelical church became the reincarnation of the pro-slavery church. And since that point, they have been fighting every single aspiration that black people have for ourselves and for our children, every aspiration we have for the kind of world in which we all have a place and enjoy the fruits of citizenship. So, I mean, you know, these theological points are significant because they drive ideologies. Now, there are moneyed interests always who stand to benefit from these ideological struggles, and so they invest where they get their benefit, but we can't lose the fact that that's why it makes a difference about whether or not you preach that folk are going to finally realize what it is to be a human when they're on the other side of the Jordan, when it really doesn't matter anymore because you're not human anymore, right? It makes a difference. It makes a difference when you begin to talk about the way in which you create a civil society is one in which some people are always the losers and some always the winners, when you just sort of rationalize that with the kind of name it and claim it theology. Right, that some folk just, so all of which is to say that I think throughout this, what we see from the very beginnings, through the transatlantic slave trade, on through slavery, on through Jim Crow, and on through where we are now, is that for us as people of faith, the religious ways in which we talk about the faith, which create the ideologies that form and shape human beings and communities, makes a difference.
One of the things that has actually really struck me as I've thought about this is the reality that Calvin himself and Luther, I mean, they were creating the constructs of Western faith, Western Protestant faith, at the exact same time, or just before, the transatlantic slave trade ramped up. And while Switzerland never did actually, have a colony with slaves, they were the primary financiers of the slave trade. They were primary financiers. The same with the Netherlands. They were very much involved, and the Dutch. And so when you're asking the question of how can the locus of orthodoxy, the locus of authority to determine what this faith actually is, what this brown, colonized, indigenous text is saying, why did it get located? Why did the locus of power get located in the heart of Europe when it's not a European text? Why do they have the authority to say, this is the way we should be reading this? And isn't it a problem that the determinations that they made about the way that we should be reading this bore no consequence on the transatlantic slave trade? When the faith itself was the faith of serially enslaved people.
How can Pharaoh preach about Moses?
Hello?
I mean, I'm just saying.
And have authority to tell you how you should be thinking about Moses.
I'm just saying.
That's the thing, right?
Well, that's the contemporary question.
That's powerful.
Right, and it becomes the one, I'm doing a lot of work on that myself, because I refer to myself as a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist, because the way I talk about it is until the Reformed faith got into the hands of the Dutch, it wasn't the same problem that it became, right? Because they developed the idea of election in a different way and predestination in a different way that made it possible to cut us out of the equation. But I mean, one of the significant pieces of saying why do they get the authority is that gives a contemporary generation the power to raise the question, why can't we claim the authority?
That's right.
To reconstruct these doctrines in light of the way we have seen them misused and abused. And significantly, why can't black folk do that? See, one of the things I've struggled with, because I said I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist congregationalist, one of the things I've struggled with are black folk abdicating the power to reclaim these doctrines and make them reflective of what we've learned about how Christianity can be a force for evil, and based on what we've learned, make it a force for good. But too often we want to abdicate that, and we want to say that, well, our faith doesn't begin until we look at what folk are doing in slavery. Well, yes, that's where black insight into the evil that Christianity can become, but we have every much of a claim on the orthodoxy, as you call it, as anyone else who calls himself a Christian.
Absolutely, even more.
Because ours is a faith of pneumatological inheritance. In other words, you become a Christian by the work of the Spirit, not simply by the work of who your parents were. You know, we've got it all messed up. We've talked about it as if it's genealogy, what makes you Christian. And we do that because that's then how the sort of folk who are European Americans claim the faith, and they're able to say, well, we are the authoritative Christians because of genealogy. But the point is, if you read Paul, flesh has nothing to do with it. It's all the work of the Spirit.
Wow, drop the mic.
There you go. So let's, I think that we've kind of moved naturally to where I wanted to go for the last part of the conversation, which is, because the title of the book, again, I want to reiterate, it's Fortune. We now have a good idea who Fortune was. Fortune, how race broke my family and the world, but then there's the last part, and how to repair it all. And we've been kind of skirting around it, but let's dig into that. So you don't want to give it all away because we want people to buy the book. All right, so get the book. We're going to put that up at the end.
Thank you.
Right. But where do you kind of sense that we need to go? Because we've been talking about these historical moves, right? The 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s. Every time we see the story almost resolve itself, it explodes and blows back open again.
Yeah.
And we're in another moment right now where we're witnessing all of these same things happen. What do we do?
Well, when I started writing the last third of the book, which is actually the part of the book that explores what is it going to take to repair what was broken, the last third, the part 3 is repair. It's broken into 3 sections: truth-telling, reparation, and forgiveness. I really believe that we, in the Christian faith, in the Jesus faith, in the brown Jesus faith, that we actually have everything we need. We have everything we need in order to repair what race broke in the world. We have confession, we have repentance, and we have forgiveness. Confession is simply truth-telling. Truth-telling is simply confession, but it takes humility to do that. It takes actual faith to do that. Actual faith in God, in the God who has your back, who's not going to allow you to be destroyed in the same way that you might have destroyed somebody else when you tell the truth about what you've done. And the God who loves and cares for and has protected and has sustained black flesh for 400, 500 years, who has sustained native flesh, indigenous flesh for 500 years. That God actually is bigger than any loss that we could think could actually tank us all. And so the process of truth-telling for people of African descent and indigenous descent and people who have been oppressed is the process of looking shame in the eye and saying, go back to hell where you belong. We don't tell the truth because we're ashamed of having been enslaved. We don't tell the truth because we're ashamed of the ways that enslavement and all of the systems and structures, the dehumanizing systems that came with it, along with Jim Crow, peonage, redlining, eminent domain, the drug wars, mass incarceration, the education apartheid, all of these health apartheid, all of these things create shame on a people. So we don't want to talk about that. But we have to go deep into our family lines, because when we do, we will see 2 things. First, we will find human beings. real people, like Fortune, like Fortune's daughter, Betty. Okay, so Betty, let me tell you about Betty Game. Betty Game, when I found her, she owned land by 1756.
Wow.
What? In Maryland. Yes, she did. And there's a tax record of a tax collector that came to collect the special black tax that was levied on black women's heads when they were free. If a woman was free, a black woman was free, and she owned land, there was an additional tax she had to pay. And Betty came out with a shotgun, I think. She refused to pay. And right there in the note, the tax collector said, Betty Game of the Fortune stock refused to pay the tax. And there's never a record of her paying tax on that land. So when we do the work, not only are we going to find the pain, we will also find our resilience, our rebellion, our image of God that somehow survived the oppression. And we will find that shame only has the power that we allow it.
So can I ask you, because it seems to me, and I appreciate that, and I think that you're right about why we don't want to go back. But it seems like that's also a stumbling block on the other side.
Yes,
this fight against critical race theory. I don't know when this is going to air, when people see this, but just this week alone, the new governor of Arkansas, my mother's home state, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, first thing she signs is an anti-CRT bill. The constant attack, Ron DeSantis in Florida, the anti-wokeness.
That's right.
All of these things to stop anything that wouldn't, literally they have said, anything that makes another student feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's
right.
Yeah.
You can't even, they're not even trying to hide it.
No.
So how do we work past that? Because that's not us.
That's right. That's not us. That is on the side of people of European descent.
Sure.
And I think that we won't get past that until people of European descent are also able to grab hold of their actual faith. It takes actual faith to tell the truth. When you were a kid and you were caught with your hand in the cookie jar, you'd probably say to your mom holding the cookie, "Wasn't me." Right, wasn't me.
Especially she had the telephone cord in her hand. I'm sorry, we came through a different generation,
right.
So that was a good incentive to tell a story.
That's right. For me, it was the back of a brush. Hello, somebody, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, wasn't me. I didn't do it. It wasn't me.
I'm following you.
Well, in the same way, their hands are in the cookie jar, and they have. George Floyd. When he was lying on that street, and people and the world watched that man die. Scales fell off of a lot of white eyes, and they had a window where they could choose to actually grab hold of their faith, and a lot of people did. But there's another sect, another river of white life in America that actually chose to re-entrench and actually to gird and protect the false narratives that gave a buffer between them and the truth, them and God, actually. It has separated them from God. Because Jesus says, I am the truth. If you can't embrace the truth, you can't embrace Jesus. You're literally keeping Jesus at arm's length from having power in your life. Because the cross, the power of the cross, is to give forgiveness for sin. But in order to do that, you have to admit you've sinned.
Yeah. Go ahead, Doc.
Well, now is the time, where the fact that I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist comes to the fore, is that I believe in the fall. I believe we live in a fallen world, and I believe that we live in a world with the power of God's love and God's mercy, and the promise of newness is continually before us, continually transforming the world. But the world in which we live and the structures, and this is where, being a Calvinist makes a difference. We look at structures. As I tell people, we could give a damn what's in your heart. What kind of structures do you create? That's what makes us not Wesleyans, right? Well,
no offense taken.
No, I'm just
right, you're right.
It's really interesting.
But I'm just saying that's what makes that's the difference between us.
Yeah.
We look at the world you create. We look at the structure, and we change the world through the structures that we create, because the world itself, given to its own devices, will simply reinscribe sin over and over and over again. So what Catholics were doing to Jews in the medieval era is what Protestants were doing to black folk in the 19th and 20th century, right? And I mean, I could just keep drawing the list. So, but all of which is to say, what do we do now, right? What we do now is have a clear eye about how evil is working in our world to reinscribe itself.
Yeah.
How is whiteness working to reinscribe itself in the particular moment in which we live? What kind of structures is it creating in terms of how we are, the world in which we're going to live, so that we can fight the structures that are taking shape in our midst? Because I think one of the problems, and this is that when you treat it as if it is a problem of the heart, you get, and I'm saying this directly, to the power community, you get a politics in which you're trying to change people's hearts when you need to be trying to change the systems that are destroying the people that we love and that we care about. And it's a different project, right? If hearts get changed, that's a wonderful thing. We can only give thanks to God. We can thank God for the Spirit, but at the end of the day, whether or not you have your knee on George Floyd's neck, I don't care what is in your heart that leads you to do that. I need a system that will punish you so that no one else will do it.
I agree.
Right. You remember I said a little bit earlier about we have the right to go back to the beginning of a tradition and claim it for ourselves.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So one of the things that is very clear is that Calvin becomes the architect of the support of slavery because the slaveholders found him convenient. In the same way slaveholders found him convenient, so did abolitionists find him convenient. So that's, so you're right in terms of reading about what happened on these shores. But I think one of the points, and this is the one speaking directly to the folk in the audience that we're speaking to, power and other, is that if you have a misjudgment and calculation of what the fight against structural evil is, then your politics will allow you to become distracted by things like income inequality. Now, income inequality is a thing. But that's not what's killing black folk, right? What's killing black folk are structural issues that may sort of be companions to things like income inequality. It may be companions to other things, but it's the basic structural issue of, one, the exploitation of black flesh, as I've spoken about before, in multiple ways to create wealth and that sort of thing, but also the kinds of ideological frames of reality that simply preclude the possibility that black people were ever meant to flourish in God's creation.
Yeah, the way that I see what you're saying is, when I study the civil rights movement, one of the things that they did, that there was like a meeting, I'm told, where they discerned what is the core spiritual lie that we are believing about ourselves. That's what we need to attack.
Right.
It's not just that we need to go out. They didn't just march or do the bus boycott because that was a good economic call. They did the bus boycott because it was the clearest manifestation of a spiritual lie. And the spiritual lie that they identified, that everybody believed, not just the white folk, but the black folk had been convinced of this too, is that some people are just created to be slaves and the others are just created to be masters. And when they came against that lie, then when Rosa Parks sat down on the bus and she said, no, she wasn't just saying, no, I'm tired. And she wasn't even just saying, no, I want to start a march. She was saying no to the lie. And that is why the civil rights movement was able to explode in that moment, because everybody else could say no to the lie and take action by addressing this particular manifestation of that lie in that space. The same was the same for the lunch counters, and Black Lives Matter is doing the same thing. The clearest manifestation of the lie in today's world is police relations among young people, young Black people. So unlike in the civil rights movement, where you had the whole church was the place, everybody was experiencing segregation, and what better place to organize everybody than the church?
Right.
The reality for us today is that young people are, generally speaking, going to be the first, they get the tip of the spear of the oppression of racial hierarchy through the police. They have direct interaction with it. So of course then, they become the organizing body of the no of our era. The no, the great no, which is the Black Lives Matter movement. But that is only one edge of many different manifestations of that single lie. Now it might not come in the same form of some people are created to be slaves and others masters. It might come in the form of some people are worth protecting and others are expendable, right? So we saw that during the COVID-19 crisis. We saw essential workers, and those essential workers by and large were brown people and Black people who were not given PPP, weren't given protection and told you must go back to work because your work is essential. But meanwhile, white folk, basically the ruling classes, were told, oh, you can take time off from work, we'll pay you to do that, we'll give you all the protection that you need in order to go out into the world, but we're going to put you on lockdown because and somehow they're not essential, and yet they're being treated like they're essential. So it was reversed.
So this is I'm just thinking about this. You know, one of the biggest challenges of doing organizing that I found, so I've been in Philly now for a good while, and our work with Power is trying to convince people of their worthiness. So, so the people in this city who, for so many reasons, have just abdicated their power to other people and allow council people and mayors and business people to just do whatever they want and they never push back. A big part of it is rooted in that lie, that it's like, well, who am I to deserve anything more than this?
That's right. Or it's just not how it works.
Well, right.
Come on, little girl. Like, it's just not
that's
how
right.
it works.
Yeah, and so we just so we just accept it, and now obviously we don't. So what's your word then to folk who are still believing that lie and internalizing it and living it out?
Well, I think that one of the things this actually gets to the point of healing. So I talk in the last chapter of Fortune about forgiveness and the beloved community. And that word forgiveness is very problematic. People are they don't like that. I didn't like that when I first heard it. I was like, are you kidding me? But it's Desmond Tutu. It's former Archbishop Desmond Tutu who wrote in his book, No Future Without Forgiveness. He wrote that forgiveness is not for the sake of the oppressor, it is for our sake. Because until we release them, then we think we need them. Until we cut the tie that binds us together, demanding that they give us what they owe us, because we are going to them to get, they owe me, they literally owe me. My great-grandfather owned a block of homes here in Philadelphia, several homes in Elmwood, which is now, I think, under a gas station on the way to the airport. That could have been legacy. That money could have paid for college educations. It could have paid for other homes. It could have paid for families to thrive. But it was taken for pennies on the dollar. Now, if I go, and I could do this, if I could go to the city and say, you owe me, right? And maybe I will. But if I demand that, and I demand that, and we all demand everything they owe us, who is going to go to their grave with a deficit? It's going to be me, because now my future is in their hands. It's tied to whether or not they decide to confess, tell the truth, whether or not they decide to repent and give reparation. If they never decide to do that, then my future, I am the one who dies at a deficit for the things that cannot be repaired. And I'm very specific on this, not everything, but for the communities like Elmwood that were busted up and will never come back, for the people who died, for Aunt Martha, who died because there was no hospital for black people in South Carolina when she had issues in birth, giving childbirth, as most the black women have. If I were to go and demand that they give my Aunt Martha back, I die at a deficit. So in order, for the sake of my body and my health, I must release them. The thing is, when I do, then I can turn to God, the one who owns cattle on 1,000 hills, and say, God, you care about the well-being of your people. You know our cries. It's time for you to ante up. It's time for you to give us what we need. And it is God's good pleasure to give God's people what they need. But if we are going to the wrong ones to get it, then we will be tied forever in a seesaw, a tug of war over stuff that we could have more than that if we went to God. Now, I say that knowing that the chapter that comes right before forgiveness is reparation.
Well, I was waiting for you to finish because I was going to ask you now.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Reparation.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
So reparation is a biblical concept. It actually, I get my teaching about reparation. It comes in multiple different places. You can see it actually at work in
Zacchaeus. Yeah. If I owe anything,
you can see it in Zacchaeus.
If I've cheated anybody.
If I cheated anybody, right?
Zacchaeus the tax collector. If I cheated.
If I cheated, but what does he do? He actually gives back not only what he owes, but more.
Right.
Like, that's Jubilee right there. You see reparation in the very construct, the structure of Jubilee. And you see it, and this is the most informative for me. This is just deep. Can you imagine if America did this? There's this moment in 2 Samuel 21:14 to the end, where he's actually praying with God, and he's saying, God, why do we have drought in the land? Why is there a famine? And then, he gets this idea. Let me call the Gibeonites. I don't know where he gets that. Must have been in prayer, right? So the Gibeonites now come. They come to him and they say, Mr. David, we have a bone to pick with you. Saul, the previous king, tried to exact genocide against all of our people. And so we have a bone to pick. And he goes, that's why we have a drought in the land. So he says to them, can you imagine America saying this? He says, what do you say that we must do for things to be made well for you? What do you say? Can you imagine the American government coming to a council of African American elders and saying, what do you say that we must do in order for things to be made well with you? And we know how God feels about it in the text, because God's response in the text is to lift the drought, because he does it. They tell him, they've already had their council meeting, they came prepared. They tell him, he does it without asking one question, and God lifts the famine.
Well, on behalf of the Gibeonites, say it's time for reparations.
Yes.
No, absolutely.
It is.
And I'm interested. Where do you fall on that, Dr. Ray? On reparations? I mean, yeah.
What is possible today?
Sure.
That's my question.
Yeah.
What is possible today? And what I mean by that is that because I look at things in terms of structures, dismantling, building new ones, etc., for the reasons I've given you before, and my sense that human beings are human beings, have been and will continue to be, it's good to have, and drastically important to recognize what is possible today so that we can organize and so we can get some victory today, and then we will fight again tomorrow. Because one of the things I think that for me becomes one of the tragedies of the Black freedom struggle has always been there have been significant and substantial people who have become so invested in asking for what is not possible today that they become frustrated and they actually end up losing the battle. Right? One of the things I'm teaching a class and I'm going to be using Eyes on the Prize when I talked about the Poor People's Campaign. And one of the things that was very clear at that point in American history was that that was not possible. There were things that were possible. Right? There were things on a federal level, on a civil level, but what ended up happening was, and the episode on Eyes on the Prize ends up with Freedom City, which had been pitched in between the Capitol buildings and whatnot, you know, dismantling itself and the people going home in defeat. And the narrator, Julian Bond, said that the largest army of people since the Second World War had been mobilized on the shores of these United States. They marched on Washington to fight for poor people, and they ended up as an army defeated. And the point was that demoralized a generation. And so for me then, what the challenge becomes, what can we get today that approximates reparations? And so I'm not saying, you know, moderate what we ultimately hope for, but, you know, to use organizing language, what can be a win today? Because part of why Donald Trump is president, or was president of the United States, was there was an entire generation of people, my daughter's generation, she's 33, who had only known us being defeated. Because she spent her entire life during the rise of conservative ascendancy.
That's true.
Right? So all she knew was us losing battle after battle after battle after battle. So what ends up happening is that in 2016, vast numbers of people who were in their 20s, early 30s, late teens, who had only known defeat, even though they had mobilized the greatest gathering of Black political power in 50 years in the Ferguson uprising, because they had only known defeat. They did not know how to translate that into what would have been an electoral powerhouse in our politics.
I want to take issue with that.
Okay.
Can I take issue?
Sure.
Because I actually think that it is the Ferguson movement that then morphed into the Black Lives Matter movement that has mobilized the strength of Stacey Abrams' movement now, and also William Barber's Poor People's Campaign that has organized poor people and allies, women, the work that I'm doing to organize women in the suburbs all over the country, particularly Black women, women of color, and white women of faith, to be allies with each other at election time. So I think that there's a reality that you name, that generation grew up only knowing defeat, but I think that they found the call to exercise dominion in the same way that Rosa Parks found when she sat on that bus and said no, and the children marched out of the church singing in Birmingham and went to jail because they were not willing to stand down. In the same way, the Black Lives Matter movement and that generation, millennials and even young people today, they are not willing to accept anything but yes. They really are, and they are willing to organize to get it, which is how we have a Senate right now that has a majority Democratic base.
Yeah. No, I think you're right on that. I think what is the difference is in the lag time, right? So what you're talking about is sort of the afterlife in terms of how it, and I'm looking at it from the vantage point, and here I will admit I'm going to claim my age and I'm going to claim all of that in saying that we didn't have to have a Supreme Court that was going to dismantle the sort of protections of law that we had that I will not live to see remedied. And I will name that frustration.
I understand that.
Is that, what the Supreme Court is dismantling now will take longer than my lifetime to restore. And I'm not arguing with you.
I feel that.
Yeah. Well, let me just say that. We are a faith-based organization. I want to thank you all for this wonderful conversation. That the three of us could probably sit here. We were in a coffee shop somewhere. They'd be turning the lights off, putting us out, giving us the hint. But so I want to just maybe kind of like leave on a note reminding us of the power of faith. And I'm kind of struck by a couple of things that you have both shared today, and that sometimes you do have to ask for the outlandish, even if you don't think you'll get it, because you never know what will happen. So two things. In Philly, Power, our Live Free team was asking and really demanding for the dismantling of the Police Advisory Commission that was window dressing. And we wanted a strong Citizens Police Oversight Board. We put it in writing, put a number of things in writing just before the pandemic. That was December 2019. The pandemic comes. The summer uprising of 2020 happens. All the electeds are scrambling for anything that's a win. We have now witnessed the dismantling of the PAC, and now we have Citizens Police Oversight Board. I was on the selection panel to pick the first commissioners. We helped draft the legislation with the council, and Elder Melanie DuBose is on that board. And so that sometimes I think, as faithful as we are, and I'll just admit, when Elder Melanie and I, we dropped those demands off in December of 19, we walked from one of our churches over there to the City Hall, and we're laughing saying, this is going to take years. I mean, like literally, we're like, this will never happen in like 10 years. And within a year,
Boom.
It was on the ballot, and it was done. So,
that's because it's a Kairos moment.
Well, but and so we have to have faith enough to ask for what we don't think will happen. I guess that's my point. The second illustration is the mother of the Juneteenth holiday, who did her walk across the country.
That's right.
And she came to Philly, and she had me out there walking with her. Mother Bethel put her up. She's an AME. And I'm thinking, like, this lady has lost her mind. These white people ain't gonna never give us a holiday.
Isn't it something?
And here we have now these are small
international
things,
holiday now.
Do you all see?
Yes.
So let me just end with that with both of you. Let me go to you first, Dr. Ray. Then I'm gonna give you the last word, Lisa, since this is your book. But in your best world, what does this repaired world look like? Let's take the shackles off. Just come on, paint the picture. Give me at least one or two things.
Well, I mean, for me, I've always said the kingdom of God looks like, quite simply, full stomachs and smiling faces and no tears to be shed anymore. And in terms of the reality in which I live, what that means is that there is no child that is not full. There is no child that is not diminished. There is no child that doesn't see the world as anything but filled with hope. So for me, that's what I mean, and there are material things to make that happen, but I keep it simple, right? Is that full stomachs and smiling faces, because evil inscribes itself on the broken bodies of our children.
Wow. All right, Lisa, so it's your book.
It's my book.
What does this world look like after it has been the 3 point, after we've told the truth, received reparations, and we've learned how to forgive? What does that look like?
The beloved community.
Okay.
So what we're looking at, in fact, the last chapter of Fortune was not going to be forgiveness. It was going to be restitution. And then I realized, but is that going to give us the beloved community? Would that get us all the way there? And the goal is the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. It's the world where no one will stand for the exploitation of the image of God on earth. And we will lay down boundaries for the ways that we will interact with each other, and we will find a new way of being together in the world that is not codified by the norms of empire or colonization or exploitation or domination, but rather we will move from the rubric or the framework of a ladder of hierarchy to the circle, the council circle, where we join hands and we decide together how we're going to do this thing called life together. And what that really will require, it will require different things of different ones of us. For people in European bodies, 2045 is coming. The reality is most of the angst that we see in the world today, we see because they see it coming. They see for the very first time in American history, this land will be a majority people of color land. And you can bet that very soon after that, if not before that, the majority of leaders then will be people of color. And when that day comes, white people deemed white by the state, will have a choice. They can actually fight that. They can fight to maintain their supremacy, which is what we're seeing now. Or they can join us in that circle, that council circle, as full equals, but only human, not God. And they have been playing God for hundreds of years. They have been at war with God for supremacy. They need to lay down their arms against God and join the community of the rest of creation in equality, in equal. For us, it will look like rising full into the image of God that we were denied for hundreds of years, and stepping up to that council table, knowing that not only do we belong here, we were created for this space.
Wow. Oh boy, great conversation. Again, I'm thankful to my friend Bishop Royster for asking me to fill in. And I'm going to leave us with this verse, passage of scripture that is somewhat familiar from the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 58:12. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. Amen.
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 Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.